He doesn't know where I am.
The words came from a 9-year-old boy, soaked to the bone from a storm that should have killed him. Clutching a photograph of the father who had become a stranger, Nurse Clara Jensen didn't know that by breaking every rule to help him, she was about to ignite a scandal that would tear through one of the city's most respected hospitals. Before the rain stopped falling, careers would crumble, lives would hang in the balance. And one child's desperate search would challenge the very heart of what it means to be human. Welcome to Golden Heart Stories. This is the story of a nurse who chose compassion over caution and a boy whose faith in kindness changed everything. The windshield wipers of Clara Jensen's aging sedan beat a relentless rhythm against the deluge, their worn rubber blades scraping across the glass, with a sound that reminded her of exhaustion itself. After 12 hours on her feet at St. Maron General Hospital in Riverton, every muscle in her body ached with that particular weariness that comes from tending to the suffering of others while neglecting your own needs. Her scrubs still carried the antiseptic smell of the emergency wing, and her hair, pulled back in a messy bun, felt damp with perspiration. Despite the cold rain hammering down outside, the storm had transformed the familiar route home into something alien and threatening. Water rushed across the asphalt in dark torrents, and the streetlights created hazy orange halos in the downpour that did little to illuminate the road ahead. Clara leaned forward, squinting through the cascading water, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She just wanted to reach her apartment, peel off these clothes, and collapse into bed before her shift tomorrow evening. Then her headlights swept across something that made her breath catch in her throat. A small figure stood beneath the skeletal remains of a broken billboard, illuminated for just a moment in the harsh white glare of her high beams. A child, no more than 9 or 10 years old, walking alone on the shoulder of the road with his thin arms wrapped around his torso. His clothes were plastered to his small frame, and he moved with the mechanical trudge of someone too exhausted to feel the cold anymore. Clara's foot moved instinctively toward the brake, but then she hesitated. Her rational mind flooded with warnings born from too many news stories, and too many years of cautious city living. This could be a trap, her thoughts whispered. This could be dangerous. You don't know who else might be watching from the darkness beyond your headlights. But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, she was already slowing down. Because beneath the calculations of risk and the armor of self-preservation, there existed something deeper in Clara Jensen, something that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. It was the part of her that could not witness suffering without extending a hand. Even when that hand trembled with uncertainty, she pulled onto the muddy shoulder, her tires throwing up spray, and lowered the passenger window. Rain immediately spattered against her arm as she leaned across the seat. "Hey," she called out, raising her voice above the roar of the storm. "Do you need help?" The boy stopped walking. He turned toward her car slowly, and in the glow of her dashboard lights, Clara could see his face, pale and drawn, with dark eyes that held exhaustion far beyond his years. Water dripped from his hair and ran in rivulets down his cheeks like tears. The storm had borrowed from him. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and Clara felt her heart breaking at the sight of this small, soaked figure standing in the downpour. Whatever doubts had flickered in her mind evaporated in that instant. She reached across and opened the passenger door, letting more rain gust into the car. "Get in," she said, and her voice was gentler, now carrying the same tone she used with frightened patients in the emergency room. "You're going to freeze out there." The boy moved forward hesitantly, climbing into the passenger seat with movements that seemed slow and careful, as if he feared she might change her mind. As he settled into the seat and she pulled the door closed, sealing them both away from the violence of the storm, Clara caught the smell of wet clothes and something else, something that reminded her of desperation. She grabbed a towel from her gym bag in the back seat and handed it to him without a word. As he pressed it against his face, his small shoulders began to shake, though whether from cold or emotion, Clara could not tell. She pulled back onto the road, her headlights cutting through the endless curtain of rain, driving toward her apartment with this stranger beside her. Clara did not know his name yet. She did not know where he had come from, or why he had been walking alone in a storm that could swallow a child whole. What she could not possibly know, as she guided her car through the flooded streets of Riverton, was that this single act of compassion, this one moment of choosing mercy over caution, would unravel every thread of the life she had so carefully woven together. Clara's modest apartment felt different with another person inside it, as if the boy's presence had rearranged the atmosphere of the space she had inhabited alone for 3 years. She moved through the small living room, pulling a thick wool blanket from the hall closet and draping it over the back of her worn sofa. The fabric held the faint scent of lavender from the sachet she kept tucked between her folded linens. One of the small comforts she allowed herself in a life that offered few indulgences. The boy stood where she had left him near the door, water dripping from his soaked clothes onto the hardwood floor. His thin arms remained wrapped around himself, shoulders hunched forward as if trying to disappear. The clothes clung to his frame in dark, sodden patches, and his sneakers made soft squelching sounds with each shift of his weight. Clara felt something unexpected rise in her chest, a maternal surge of concern, a protective instinct she had not expected to feel for this stranger child. "Come here," she said gently, her voice taking on the soft tone she used with frightened children in the emergency room. She gestured toward the couch. "Let's get you warm." He moved cautiously, each step deliberate, as though he expected the kindness to evaporate if he moved too quickly. When he reached the sofa, Clara wrapped the blanket around his narrow shoulders, tucking the edges with the same care she used settling patients into hospital beds. His skin felt alarmingly cold beneath her fingertips, and she could see the faint blue tinge around his lips that told her how long he had been in that storm. In the kitchen, Clara heated chicken noodle soup on the stove, stirring slowly while her mind churned through questions she did not yet know how to ask. The apartment filled with the comforting smell of broth and herbs, such a contrast to the antiseptic odors clinging to her scrubs. She poured the steaming liquid into her favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle she could never throw away, and carried it back to the living room. He accepted the mug carefully, wrapping his small fingers around the ceramic as if drawing warmth from it. He took a cautious sip, then another, and Clara watched as tension eased from his shoulders. Color slowly returned to his cheeks, spreading like watercolor across paper, and his violent shivering subsided into occasional tremors. "What's your name?" Clara asked softly, settling into the armchair across from him. "Eli," he whispered, barely audible. "Eli Matthews." "I'm Clara," she replied, offering a small smile. "You're safe here, Eli. I promise." Something flickered in his dark eyes at those words, a mixture of relief and wariness that suggested he had learned not to trust promises easily. He reached into his soaked jeans pocket with one hand while balancing the mug in the other, and pulled out a photograph. The paper was damp and crumpled, edges soft from moisture, but he handled it with careful reverence. He held it out without speaking. Clara took it gently from his cold fingers. The photograph showed the main entrance of a hospital, glass doors, reflecting afternoon sun, and above them in polished steel letters was a name she recognized immediately. St. Maron General Hospital. Her hospital. The place where she had just spent 12 exhausting hours. Clara's breath caught as she stared at the image, her mind racing to connect pieces of a puzzle she had not known existed. She looked up at Eli, at his dark eyes watching her with an intensity far too old for a child of 9 years old, and felt the weight of something larger settling onto her shoulders. Before she could form the questions crowding her tongue, a sound from the television drew her attention. She had left it on for background noise, but now the late-night news anchor's voice cut through the quiet with sharp urgency. "Breaking news tonight," the woman announced, her professional concern perfectly calibrated. "Riverton police have issued a missing child alert. 9-year-old Eli Matthews was last seen this evening near the intersection of Harbor Street and Route 17. Clara's eyes snapped to the screen as a school photograph appeared beside the anchor's face. The same dark eyes, the same serious expression, the same boy now sitting on her sofa wrapped in her blanket. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the full weight crashed over her. This child was not just lost. He was being searched for. People were looking for him. And she had brought him here, into her home, without telling anyone. The silence following the news broadcast felt heavy and suffocating, pressing down on Clara's chest like a physical weight. She sat frozen in the armchair, the photograph clutched in her trembling fingers, while the television continued its relentless cycle. The anchor had moved on to other stories, but Eli's school portrait remained burned into Clara's mind with crystalline clarity. She forced herself to look at the boy himself, the real child sitting just feet away wrapped in her blanket. Eli had gone completely still, his small hands wrapped around the mug of soup that was surely growing cold by now. He watched her with those impossibly dark eyes, and in their depths Clara could see something that made her heart constrict. He had known she would see the news. He had been waiting for this moment, bracing himself for whatever would come next. Eli, Clara said softly, leaning forward. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, anchored by years of practice remaining calm during emergencies. That photo you showed me. The hospital. Tell me why you have it. He looked down at the mug in his hands, and for a long moment Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it above the distant thunder still rolling across the city. My father works there, he whispered, each word seeming to cost him something precious. At the hospital in the picture. Clara felt her breath catch as the pieces suddenly clicked into place with devastating clarity. The photograph was not random. It was a destination, a goal, a beacon he had been walking toward through that terrible storm. "What's your father's name?" she asked, though some part of her already sensed the answer would change everything. Eli lifted his eyes to meet hers, and in that moment he looked far older than 9 years old, weighted down by knowledge that no child should carry. "Dr. Marcus Reed," he said, and the name fell between them like a stone into still water. "He's a heart surgeon." The room seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. Dr. Marcus Reed. She knew that name intimately. Everyone who worked at St. Maron General Hospital knew that name. He was the hospital's most renowned cardiac surgeon, a man whose reputation preceded him through every corridor and nurse's station. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times during her years there, always moving with purpose through the halls. Always surrounded by residents and administrators, always projecting an aura of competence and distance that discouraged casual conversation. But she had never known he had a son. She had never heard anyone mention his family, never caught glimpses of personal photographs in his office. Dr. Reed existed in her understanding as a purely professional entity. A skilled pair of hands that performed miracles in the operating room and then disappeared into whatever life he led beyond hospital walls. "Does he know you were coming to find him?" Clara asked, though the question felt foolish even as she spoke it. Eli shook his head slowly, his expression closing off into something guarded and remote. "He doesn't know where I am. He doesn't know anything." The bitterness in those last words was unmistakable, a sharp edge that cut through the childish cadence of his voice. Clara felt something inside her chest crack open at the sound of it, at the weight of loneliness and abandonment. That a child so young should never have to bear. She set the photograph down carefully on the coffee table between them and reached out, placing her hand gently over Eli's where it gripped the mug. His fingers felt cold despite the warmth he had been holding. "Listen to me," Clara said, and she let all the conviction she possessed flow into her words. "Tomorrow morning, we're going to go to that hospital together. We're going to find your father. And I promise you, Eli, I will make sure he sees you. I will make sure he knows you came all this way to find him." Eli searched her face for a long moment, looking for something she hoped he would find there. Trust, perhaps. Or certainty. Or simply the assurance that this stranger who had stopped in the rain would not abandon him the way others clearly had. Finally, slowly, he nodded. It was a small gesture, barely more than a slight dip of his chin. But Clara felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders with that single movement. She had made a promise to a child who had already been failed by the adults who should have protected him. And now, somehow, she would have to find a way to keep it. The morning light filtering through the glass doors of St. Maron General Hospital felt harsher than Clara remembered, bright fluorescent glare, mixing with pale sunlight to create an atmosphere that felt clinical and unforgiving. She walked through the familiar entrance with Eli's small hand clasped tightly in hers. Feeling the weight of curious stares from passing staff members who recognized her but registered the child beside her with obvious confusion. Eli had been quiet during the drive over, staring out the window with that distant expression that made him seem older than his years. Now, as they approached the main reception desk, Clara felt his fingers tighten around hers, a small tremor of nervousness passing through his grip. She squeezed back gently, hoping to convey reassurance she did not entirely feel. The receptionist behind the desk, a middle-aged woman named Margaret whom Clara had greeted hundreds of times, looked up from her computer with a professional smile that froze slightly when her eyes landed on Eli. "Good morning, Clara," Margaret said, her tone carefully neutral. "I didn't know you were working today." "I'm not," Clara replied, forcing confidence despite the anxiety coiling in her stomach. "I need you to page Dr. Marcus Reed for me, please. It's important." Margaret's fingers hovered uncertainly over her keyboard, and something shifted in her expression. A subtle tightening around her eyes that Clara recognized as discomfort. "I'm sorry, Clara, but I can't page doctors for personal visits. Privacy regulations. If you need to speak with Dr. Reed, you'll have to go through proper channels." The words landed like stones, each one building a wall between Clara and her promise. She had known this would not be simple, but hearing the refusal spoken aloud made the obstacle feel suddenly insurmountable. "Margaret, please," Clara said, hating the pleading note in her voice. "This is his son. Eli needs to see his father." Margaret's gaze dropped to Eli, and Clara saw sympathy flicker across her face before the professional mask reasserted itself. "I understand, but I still can't help you. Hospital policy is very clear." A security guard materialized at her elbow, summoned by some invisible signal. He was young, probably fresh from training, his hand resting with nervous authority on the radio at his belt. "Ma'am, I need to ask you about the child," he said, his voice carefully modulated. "No minors are allowed in the hospital without a legal guardian present. It's policy." Clara felt Eli press closer against her side, his breathing rapid and shallow. Everything about this moment was wrong, the bureaucratic machinery grinding forward with complete indifference to the human need standing before it. "I'm taking care of him," Clara said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We just need 5 minutes with Dr. Reed. That's all I'm asking." "Without proper authorization, I can't allow it," the guard replied, genuine regret in his eyes, though it changed nothing. The click of heels on polished floor announced another arrival. Sylvia Grant, the director of infection control, approached with her clipboard. Clutched against her chest like a shield, her expression set in lines of disapproval. Clara had always found Sylvia difficult, a woman who viewed every interaction through the lens of potential liability. But now that tendency felt actively hostile. "Clara Jensen," Sylvia said, her voice carrying the crisp bite of authority. "What exactly is going on here?" Clara opened her mouth to explain, but Sylvia's gaze had already moved past her to settle on Eli with unmistakable displeasure. "You brought an unauthorized minor into the hospital?" Sylvia's tone made it sound like criminal negligence. "Are you aware of the protocols you're violating? The liability issues? The safety concerns? This is Dr. Reed's son," Clara said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "He just needs to see his father. Then his father can arrange an appropriate meeting through proper channels," Sylvia replied, her words cutting through Clara's protest like a scalpel. "What you're doing here is letting emotion interfere with protocol, and that is precisely the kind of behavior that puts this entire institution at risk." The reprimand hung in the air between them, sharp and final. Clara looked down at Eli and saw his face had gone pale, his dark eyes reflecting disappointment so profound it made her chest ache. She had promised him she would make this happen, and now she was failing him before an audience of institutional indifference. The wall of policy stood before them, immovable and cold, and Clara did not know how to tear it down. Something shifted in Clara's chest as she stood in that sterile lobby. A transformation from resignation into defiance that felt almost physical in its intensity. She looked down at Eli's pale face, at the defeat already settling into his features, and felt her resolve crystallize into something hard and unbreakable. She had not come this far, had not made promises to a child who had already been failed too many times. Only to surrender to policies that valued procedure over humanity. "Come on," Clara whispered, her fingers tightening around Eli's hand with renewed purpose. Before anyone could react or question her intentions, she turned away from the reception desk and began walking with deliberate speed toward the east corridor. The one that led away from the public areas and into the deeper arteries of the hospital. Behind her, she heard Margaret's startled voice calling her name, followed by the crackle of the security guard's radio coming to life, but Clara did not slow down. She knew this building intimately, had walked these halls for years during countless shifts, and that knowledge became her advantage now. She guided Eli through a side door marked staff only, her badge granting passage with a familiar beep. The corridor beyond was dim and narrow, lit by intermittent fluorescent panels humming with electrical persistence. The walls were painted institutional beige that seemed designed to discourage lingering. And the floor tiles bore scuff marks of countless gurneys wheeled through over the years. Clara moved quickly but not frantically, her training keeping her movements efficient even as her heart hammered with the dangerous thrill of transgression. Eli kept pace beside her, his small legs working to match her stride, and when Clara glanced down, she saw that some defeat had lifted from his expression, replaced by something that looked almost like hope. The fact that she was still fighting for him seemed to breathe new life into his fragile trust. They navigated through the maze of back hallways, past break rooms, where tired staff grabbed coffee and storage closets filled with medical supplies, heading steadily toward the surgical wing where Dr. Reed's office was located. Clara had never been inside that office, but she knew where it was. Everyone at St. Maron knew where the renowned cardiac surgeon kept his domain. The hallway grew quieter as they moved deeper into the hospital's interior, the sounds of the main lobby fading behind them like echoes of another world. Her badge worked on another locked door, then another, each beep feeling like a small victory against the system that had tried to stop them. Finally, they turned a corner and Clara saw it. The door at the end of the hallway, polished wood with a brass nameplate reading Dr. Marcus Reed, Cardiac Surgery. The sight made her breath catch, the goal suddenly real and tangible after feeling impossibly distant. She approached with Eli's hand still clasped in hers, feeling the weight of what they had done pressing down on her shoulders. Her free hand reached toward the handle, fingers extending with determination and dread. The handle refused to turn. Locked. The small defeat felt disproportionately crushing after everything they had risked to reach this point. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool wood for just a moment, gathering herself, trying to think of what to do next. Then, cutting through the quiet like a knife, came the harsh electronic shriek of a security alarm. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off walls and ceiling, transforming the dim corridor into a trap rapidly closing around them. Red lights began flashing in panels Clara had not noticed before, bathing everything in urgent crimson pulses. Through the alarm's wail, Clara heard another sound that made her blood run cold. Sylvia Grant's voice, crisp and authoritative even through the distortion of the radio system, ordering a sweep of the staff corridors. They had been discovered. The machinery of institutional authority was mobilizing against them. Clara looked down at Eli and saw her own fear reflected in his wide eyes. They had come so far, broken so many rules, risked so much, and they were standing before a locked door with nowhere left to run. The forbidden corridor that had seemed like their path to salvation had become their prison. And the walls were closing in with the inexorable certainty of institutional power reasserting control. The security alarm continued its relentless shriek, the sound drilling into Clara's skull with mechanical persistence that made coherent thought almost impossible. She stood paralyzed before the locked door, her mind racing through options that all led to the same inevitable conclusion. They were trapped, and within minutes security would arrive to drag them back in shame and defeat. Then she felt it, a subtle change in Eli's grip, his small hand suddenly loosening in hers, the fingers that had clutched her so tightly going slack. Clara looked down sharply, her nurse's instincts flaring to immediate alert even before her conscious mind registered what was happening. Eli's face had gone from pale to ashen, a sickly gray pallor spreading across his skin. His eyes, which had been wide with fear just moments before, now seemed unfocused and distant, staring at nothing. A fine sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool air, and his breathing had become rapid and shallow, each breath a small desperate gasp. "Eli?" Clara said, her voice sharp with concern that immediately transformed into alarm. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands moving automatically to his forehead, to his neck, checking for the vital signs that would tell her what was happening to his small body. His skin felt burning hot beneath her palm, fever radiating from him with an intensity that sent ice through Clara's veins. This was not the remnants of being cold and wet from the storm. This was something acute and dangerous, something that had been building in his system while they navigated the hospital's corridors. Before Clara could speak again, Eli's legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed like a puppet with severed strings, his small body crumpling toward the hard floor. Clara caught him, her arms wrapping around him as she eased him down, cradling his head to prevent it from striking the tiles. Eli, stay with me. Clara's voice cracked with panic she had not allowed herself to feel during all the bureaucratic obstacles, but felt now with overwhelming force as she held this fevered child in her arms. She pressed her fingers to his neck, finding his pulse racing far too fast, his skin far too hot, his breathing far too labored. The corridor's red emergency lights continued their crimson pulses, bathing them both in urgent color that matched the crisis unfolding in Clara's arms. She needed help. She needed it now. Every second mattered, and all the rules that had stood between them. And Dr. Reed suddenly seemed grotesque in the face of a child's life hanging in the balance. Clara looked up from Eli's unconscious form, her eyes scanning the empty hallway. The alarm still wailed its electronic accusation, and somewhere in the distance she could hear running footsteps growing closer. Security was coming, staff was coming, but would they help a child who had triggered their alarms, or would they focus first on the breach of protocol? She made a decision in that moment that felt both desperate and inevitable. She lifted her voice above the alarm, shouting with all the authority she had learned during years of emergency room crises. I need help. Medical emergency. I have a child with high fever and altered consciousness in Corridor 7 West. Her voice echoed off the walls, carrying down the hallways with the unmistakable urgency of a medical professional confronting a life-threatening situation. This was no longer about finding a father or breaking rules or fighting institutional indifference. This was about a 9-year-old boy burning with fever in her arms, his small chest rising and falling with breaths that came too quick and too shallow. Clara bent over Eli, her hand stroking his damp hair back from his forehead, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. Hold on, Eli. Please hold on. Help is coming. But even as she spoke the words, she felt the cold certainty settling in her chest that they had run out of time. The bureaucracy had won after all, not through its policies, but through the simple cruel mathematics of delay. While they had been arguing with receptionists and sneaking through corridors and standing before locked doors, this child's condition had been deteriorating. And now he lay unconscious in her arms with help still somewhere in the distance, running toward them. But not yet here, not yet able to save him from whatever was burning through his small body with such terrible heat. The morning meeting had dragged on with the particular tedium that afflicted all administrative gatherings at St. Maron General Hospital. A parade of budget reports that required Dr. Marcus Reed's presence but not his full attention. He sat near the window, his mind half present while Patricia Doyle from Human Resources outlined new compliance procedures. Then something caught his eye. A small object on the polished floor near his chair. Marcus leaned down, his fingers closing around what felt like a photograph, damp and wrinkled. He turned it over, and the world seemed to tilt sideways. The photograph showed the entrance of St. Maron General Hospital, the glass doors and steel letters he passed through every morning. But it was the handwriting scrawled across the bottom in a child's uncertain script that made his heart stop. The ink had run from moisture, but the words were still legible, still devastating. I will come here to find Dad. Marcus stared at the photograph, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. That handwriting. He knew that handwriting. He had seen it on birthday cards and school assignments, on notes left on the kitchen counter before everything fell apart. Eli. This was Eli's handwriting. The conference room seemed to recede around him, voices becoming distant. His son had written this. His 9-year-old son had written these words on a photograph of the hospital where Marcus worked, and somehow that photograph had ended up here. The implications crashed over him like successive waves, each one more terrible than the last. Marcus pushed back from the table so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly, drawing startled looks. He did not care. He could not care about their meetings when his son had been here, had been trying to find him. "I have to go," Marcus said, his voice rough and urgent. He did not wait for permission, simply stood and moved toward the door with the photograph clutched in his hand. Patricia started to say something, but Marcus was already gone, pushing through the door and into the hallway. His long strides carried him toward the main entrance, his mind racing. When had Eli been here? Was he still here? Why had no one told him? He burst through the doors to the main lobby and immediately saw the security guard and Margaret clustered near the front desk. But it was what lay beyond them, visible through the glass entrance doors, that made Marcus break into a run. Rain. The storm had returned, sheets of water cascading from a dark sky. And there, just beyond the overhang, barely protected from the deluge, was a figure he would have recognized anywhere. Clara Jensen, the night shift nurse, was kneeling on the wet pavement. And cradled in her arms, limp and unconscious, was Eli. Marcus exploded through the entrance doors into the rain, water immediately soaking through his white coat, plastering his hair to his skull. He felt nothing except the desperate need to reach his son. Eli. The name tore from his throat, raw and anguished. He dropped to his knees beside Clara in the pouring rain, his hands reaching for his son with trembling desperation. Eli's face was pale, his small body radiating heat that Marcus could feel even through the cold rain. Clara looked up at him, and in her eyes Marcus saw everything. The accusation, the exhaustion, the fierce determination. "He has a high fever," Clara said, her voice cutting through the rain with professional authority. "He collapsed in the corridor. He needs treatment now." Marcus gathered Eli into his own arms, feeling the terrible heat of his son's small body, seeing how his chest rose and fell with breaths that came too fast. His surgeon's hands, so steady in the operating room, shook as they held this child he had failed, this boy who had walked through a storm to find him. "I've got you," Marcus whispered against Eli's damp hair, though whether he was speaking to his son or to himself, he could not say. "I've got you now. I'm here." The rain poured down on them all, washing away everything except the essential truth. A father who had been too distant. A son who had been too desperate. A nurse who had refused to stop fighting. And now, finally, in the middle of a storm, they had found each other. Marcus rose to his feet with Eli cradled against his chest and turned back toward the hospital entrance, moving with purposeful speed. Behind him, Clara struggled to her feet, and together they rushed back inside. Carrying the child who had brought them together through his desperate search for the father who should never have been so hard to find. The treatment room felt too small for all the emotion it contained, the walls pressing in with the weight of everything that had been broken and might still be mended. Marcus worked with focused intensity over Eli's small form on the examination table. His hands moving with the precision that had made him one of the hospital's most respected surgeons. An intravenous line fed fluids and medication into Eli's arm, and Marcus monitored the vital signs with attention that went far beyond professional duty. Clara stood beside him, matching his movements with practiced efficiency. She anticipated what he needed before he asked, handing him supplies, adjusting equipment, her exhaustion pushed aside by the demands of caring for this child. They worked in near silence, communicating through glances and gestures. Slowly, gradually, Eli's condition began to stabilize. His breathing grew less labored, settling into a steadier rhythm. The fever medication began its work, bringing down the dangerous temperature. The monitors showed vital signs moving toward normal ranges, each beep a small victory. Marcus pulled up a chair and sat down heavily beside the examination table. His professional composure finally cracking now that the immediate danger had passed. He reached out with trembling fingers and took Eli's hand in his own, that small hand that had once fit so perfectly in his palm before the divorce and the distance. And all the ways Marcus had convinced himself that his work mattered more than his presence. Clara watched the transformation in Marcus's face, the way the mask of professional competence fell away to reveal something vulnerable and devastated beneath. "He still believes in you," Clara said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence with words she had been holding since she first found Eli in the storm. "Even after everything, even when you weren't there. He walked through that storm because he believed you were worth finding." The words landed on Marcus like physical blows. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, and when he finally looked up at Clara, His eyes were red-rimmed and raw with tears he had been too proud or too frightened to shed until now. "I failed him," Marcus said, and his voice broke on the confession. "I convinced myself that providing for him was enough. That success in the operating room could somehow compensate for absence at home. I told myself he understood, that he was fine, that I would have more time later." He looked down at Eli's unconscious face. "But he wasn't fine. He needed his father, and I wasn't there." The raw honesty in his voice seemed to fill the small room. Clara felt her own anger at the system, at the bureaucracy, at everything that had made this day so difficult, beginning to shift into something more complex. This was not just about institutional failure. It was also about human failure, about the thousand small choices that led parents away from their children. "But you're here now," Clara said, and there was both challenge and invitation in her voice. "The question is what you do with that. Whether this changes anything, or whether you go back to your office and convince yourself that this was just an exception. A crisis moment that doesn't require fundamental change." Marcus looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Seeing past the uniform to the person who had risked everything for a child who meant nothing to her except that he was a child who needed help. Clara had fought against protocols, had sneaked through corridors and broken rules and held Eli in the rain. When everyone else had prioritized policy over human need. "It changes everything," Marcus whispered, his grip tightening on Eli's hand. "I swear to you, it changes everything." At that moment, a knock at the door announced Sylvia Grant, her clipboard still clutched against her chest like armor. She stood in the doorway, her expression caught between disapproval and uncertainty. "The rules were followed for safety," Sylvia said, but her words fell flat in the space between them, empty and defensive. "We have procedures for a reason." The silence that followed her statement was profound and damning. Marcus did not even look at her. Clara met her gaze steadily but said nothing. And Sylvia, confronted with the inadequacy of her own defense, slowly withdrew from the doorway, her clipboard held a little less tightly. Her certainty shaken by the wreckage her precious protocols had nearly created. The incident rippled outward through St. Maron General Hospital like a stone thrown into still water. The waves spreading through every department until no one could claim ignorance of what had happened. The story transformed as it traveled, becoming less about protocols and more about what those protocols had nearly cost. A 9-year-old boy walking through a storm to find his father. A nurse who refused to abandon him. A system that valued rules over lives until confronted with the consequences of its own rigidity. The public response came swiftly and with force. Local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly St. Maron found itself at the center of a conversation about institutional compassion. Parents called in to share their own experiences of being turned away by bureaucratic obstacles when their children needed help. Medical professionals spoke about the tension between necessary safety protocols and the paralyzing fear of liability that prevented common sense. The hospital administration, faced with mounting pressure, launched an internal investigation. Patricia Doyle from Human Resources found herself leading a committee tasked with examining not just what had happened, but why. And what structural changes were needed to ensure it never happened again. The investigation's findings were damning in their clarity. The hospital's policies had been followed to the letter, and yet a child had nearly died because those policies contained no provision for human judgment. No space for compassion to override procedure when the situation demanded it. The report documented how multiple staff members had witnessed Eli's distress but felt unable to act without proper authorization. But the investigation did not stop at documentation. It demanded change. And at the center of that change, proposed by Marcus Reed himself and championed by Clara Jensen, was something they called the Eli Initiative. The program was designed to address the failures that had nearly proven fatal. It established clear protocols for helping vulnerable children and families who fell through the cracks. It created an emergency advocacy position, staffed by trained professionals who could cut through bureaucratic obstacles when a child's welfare was at stake. It mandated training for all staff on recognizing situations where rigid adherence to policy would cause more harm than good. It built bridges between departments, ensuring that information about at-risk children reached the people who could help them. Marcus threw himself into the work with the fervor of someone seeking redemption. He attended every committee meeting, reviewed every proposed policy change, and used his considerable influence to push for aggressive reforms. He no longer disappeared into his office between surgeries, but instead could be found in staff meetings and training sessions, speaking with a passion that surprised those who had only known him as the distant surgeon who lived for his work. Clara worked beside him, bringing her front-line experience and her unflinching willingness to speak truth to power. She pushed back against compromises that would water down the initiative's effectiveness, insisting that changes needed to be real and not merely cosmetic gestures. Together, they formed an unlikely but effective partnership, united by their shared experience of that day when everything had hung in the balance. The hospital began to change. Slowly at first, with resistance from those who preferred established procedures, but gathering momentum as more staff members recognized that the Eli Initiative represented something they had been waiting for. A permission to be human. A framework that valued wisdom alongside rules, that acknowledged the messy reality that sometimes doing the right thing meant deviating from the prescribed path. Eli himself, recovered from his fever and back home with his father, became an unexpected symbol of what the hospital was trying to become. His photograph, the one he had carried through the storm, with those desperate words scrawled across it, was mounted in the hospital's main lobby alongside a plaque explaining the Eli Initiative. It served as a daily reminder to everyone who passed through those doors that behind every policy were real people with real needs that could not always be reduced to forms and authorizations. The hospital was rebuilding its humanity, one policy change and one training session at a time. And at the heart of it all was the memory of a small boy who had believed his father was worth finding, even when everyone else had stopped believing that finding him should be possible. Months had passed since that day when everything had changed, and the seasons had turned with the quiet inevitability of time moving forward. The air carried that particular coolness that promised the return of rain, and the leaves on the trees lining Riverton's streets had begun their transformation from green to gold. Clara Jensen drove home from her shift at St. Maron General Hospital along the same route she had traveled that night when she first found Eli. The hospital had changed in visible and invisible ways since then. The Eli Initiative had taken root, growing from a proposal into a functioning program that had already helped dozens of families. Clara had been recognized for her role in saving Eli and pushing for reform. But the recognition mattered less than knowing that the next child who walked through those doors would be met with compassion rather than bureaucracy. The sky darkened as she drove, clouds gathering with the weight of water they were preparing to release. Clara watched the first drops begin to fall against her windshield, the familiar rhythm of rain that seemed to mark the important moments of her life. Another rainstorm sweeping through Riverton. Then she saw her, a young girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, walking alone along the shoulder of the road in the gathering downpour. The sight sent an electric jolt of recognition through Clara's body, a sense of déjà vu so powerful it made her hands tighten on the steering wheel. The girl walked with her arms wrapped around herself, her clothes already soaked, her small figure silhouetted against the darkening sky. For one moment, Clara hesitated. The memory of everything that had happened with Eli flooded through her mind. The complications, the bureaucracy, the way one act of kindness had unraveled her entire life. She had been changed by that experience, and part of her wondered if she had the strength to face it again. But even as the hesitation flickered through her consciousness, Clara was already slowing down, already pulling onto the muddy shoulder, already lowering the passenger window. Because she had learned something fundamental that night when she first stopped for Eli. Kindness was not meant to be convenient. Compassion was not something you offered only when it was easy. The choice to help was made again and again, each time the rain fell and the road revealed someone walking alone. Clara leaned across the seat, rain spattering against her arm through the open window, and called out to the girl with a voice that carried both authority and warmth. "Do you need help?" The girl turned toward her, and in the glow of the dashboard lights Clara could see her face, young and frightened and soaked with rain. The girl looked at Clara with the particular wariness of a child who had learned not to trust easily. But then, slowly, the girl nodded. It was a small gesture, barely more than a dip of her chin, but it contained a desperate hope that someone might actually care enough to stop. Clara reached across and opened the passenger door, letting more rain gust into the car. Get in. You're going to freeze out there. The girl climbed into the passenger seat with careful movements. And as Clara pulled the door closed and turned up the heat, she felt the weight of responsibility settling onto her shoulders once more. She did not know this girl's story yet. She did not know where she had come from or what circumstances had left her walking alone in a rainstorm. But she knew that she would find out, and she knew that she would help. As Clara pulled back onto the road, her headlights cutting through the rain, she remembered something she had said to Eli on that first night, words that had been true then and felt even truer now. She glanced at the girl beside her, at this small stranger who had trusted her enough to accept help, and Clara spoke quietly into the sound of rain drumming on the roof. Kindness must never be an accident. The words hung in the air between them, a promise and a philosophy and a commitment to the principle that had transformed her life. The rain continued to fall, washing the roads clean, and Clara drove forward into the storm, carrying this child toward safety, knowing that she would do it again tomorrow and every day that the rain returned and revealed another soul in need of shelter. Because that was what it meant to be human. Not to help once and call it sufficient, but to help again and again, as many times as the world demanded it, as many times as the rain fell. And someone walked alone waiting for a stranger to stop and offer mercy. When the rain falls again, remember kindness must never be an accident. If this story moved you, leave a comment or share it with someone who still believes in compassion. Subscribe for more stories that warm the heart and remind us what it means to be human. Thank you for watching. This has been Golden Heart Stories.